thank you for coming.
Great to be here.
The intro there mentioned you were one teacher of the year, and I've already learned in our brief discussions quite a bit from you. So we're happy to take some questions from the audience if there's time, but I do have a few that I'd like to start with. So you've written quite a few research papers on bequests and major giving, and I was looking at one of them recently, and it talked about this hypothesis that people would likely give estate gifts not to causes that would help them in their lifetime, because once you give the estate gift, you're not alive anymore. So I thought immediately, I'm like, that makes sense, of course. And then you go a little further and it says this got mixed results. And what it reminded me of is that in the industry, there are a lot of smart people, a lot of smart fundraisers who have a lot of good ideas that are usually true. But what can you speak to using data to prove that these great ideas actually are true?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the challenges especially in philanthropy in general, is that we have kind of these standard assumptions about how people behave. Specifically, if you come from a kind of purely rational economic model, and what we find is that a lot of those assumptions don't necessarily work within this within the context of giving. That we're almost in a different world, and that's not a new idea. We can actually go back to the late 1800s with Marcel Mauss and some ideas that giving is a separate economy. It uses separate rules, and the gift giving process is not the same as our transactional commercial sort of economy. And because of that, many of the things that we expect to be true, because in a commercial context they are, we actually go to the data and find that that's not actually how people behave. And we're much more in a context or a world where things like story and tangibility and visualizability, these things matter a good deal more than what we think ought to matter, like accounting and efficiency and some of those technical aspects. And I think that research that you refer to is just another example where we take this standard rational utility maximizing model, we apply it to charitable giving, and it just doesn't fit.
Yeah, and that's lessons I've learned along the lines along the road too. So I come at this from a computer science AI background, and the lessons learned about people's behavior, even just the not that the economic explanation never applies, but it's all these things kind of playing together. Kind of along those lines, Senator Deacon mentioned in the opening panel that he did not like being sold, right? Don't send me stuff in the mail to sell me on your cause. And I think that's in general, but how does that apply in major giving and bequest giving in particular?
Well, I think that's a great point, and let me try to sort of distinguish between two really different worlds, and that is the world of small gifts. What you might call social compliance or pat on the head gifts, in the world of major gifts of assets, which is very large transformational gifts, estate gifts. These worlds are actually different worlds. And it comes back to this idea of, as you mentioned, being sold or not being sold. So, Greg, we were talking, and I compare it to the old joke about the person who at night is outside the restaurant looking for their keys underneath the light. And a person comes by and says, "Oh, let me help you," and then asks, "Where did you lose your keys?" "Oh, well, at the other end of the block." Well, why are you looking here? Well, that's because that's where the light is. And oftentimes we see this in the data analysis in charitable giving, because we have lots and lots of light on the small gift decision. We can replicate it in the lab. We can have thousands and thousands of observations, and we can learn a lot about little tweaks we can do for that small gift decision. It turns out that that small gift decision is not the same decision process as a major lifetime investment, a major gift of assets, which could be either in the estate context or in the principal gift context. So that comes back to then the question of, well, I don't like to be sold. Those two messages are fundamentally different messages. And let me explain why. The fundamental message that can work quite well in a small gift or pat on the head gift context is where I, as a charity, come to you and I try to sell you my story. Basically, this is a fundraising approach that says, um, I'm fantastic. Can I have some money, please? Right. And that's a very salesy oriented approach. However, when we get into that major gifts context, we actually have to reverse that. And we have to begin with the donor and the donor's values and life story, what's important to them. And then we see if there are links between their life story and what's important to them and a major gift of an asset and what impact that might have. So it's a really different flavor where you're trying to sell your story versus where you're trying to learn the donor's story. And is it possible that we can be a part of it? You might think of this in terms of the universal hero story, or what's called a monomyth. Now, in that hero story, there can be two different ways to tell the story. We can tell the story where the charity is the hero, and really the role of the donor there is to just sort of honor those heroic administrators, to lay some money at their feet, and then to go away. They're kind of a minor character. They're just the ATM that you have to whack every once in a while. But an alternate version of that story, which you might call the donor hero story, is where the organization serves as the donor's magical instrument or weapon of impact. So it's sort of like the hammer of Thor, right? The hammer of Thor makes Thor very powerful, but the hammer is not the hero. Thor is the hero. And in the same way, in the major gifts context, it is the donor who is the hero and the organization that is the donor's hammer, in a sense, to really make an impact that donor couldn't do by herself.
Fun to hear an Avengers comparison, but it certainly works. So yeah, something you said just a bit earlier there kind of leads into my own research, and we try to predict the donor journey, right? And it is on these smaller gifts at the moment. So what should you do next to encourage a donation or increase someone's donation? And we knew from the beginning that this was a completely separate model for major gifts. So in the data, we just took major givers out because what was the point? This is a different ball game. But we'd like to do that with the donor journey. So what kind of actions do you think you could model the donor journey for major or planned giving, or is it just two steps? Can you see the journey and what you think it might be?
Yeah, sure. So those are two different questions, looking at major gifts and estate gifts. Now, one of the sort of barriers in major gifts is what you might think of as the reference point issue, and that is the idea that we can think of giving as out of different pools of money. Most people think of donations as something that comes out of disposable income, something that and if I think of giving as something that comes out of disposable income, then I'm going to compare it to other sort of weekly or monthly expenditures that I have, what I just spent at Starbucks, for example. And that's going to keep gifts relatively small. The separate comparison is if we can get a donor to begin to think of donations as something that comes from assets. That is something that comes from wealth. And that's very important because it changes the reference point. Now, this is a concept from behavioral economics called mental accounting, which actually a couple of years ago, the Nobel Prize went to an economist in part for this idea. in story terms, you can think about it as the setting of the story. Are we in the land of wealth sharing? And so, an example of that, which we can find from massive, massive data analysis, comes from a paper that I had published where we looked at over 1 million nonprofit tax returns over a 6-year period to see what predicts long term fundraising growth. And it turns out one of the most powerful predictors of long term fundraising growth is whether or not and the extent to which the organization was raising gifts from non cash assets, in particular, stocks, closely held companies, and real estate. Now, one of the explanations for that is that fundamentally, with the donor, if you get a $10,000 gift of stock, that is much more powerful than a $10,000 gift of cash. Because one of the things we know about that gift of stock is it is a gift of an asset, it is a gift of wealth. And you're beginning to change the donor's frame of reference when you get the donor to act in a way that they are giving out of wealth. Now, how can we begin that journey? One of the most powerful ways to begin that journey is to simply share stories of other people like me, which is like the donor, who have done things like this. If you can communicate to a donor that people like me do things like this, with the me being from the donor's perspective, that can be enormously powerful. So that can be powerful in a gift of assets context, which then shifts the reference point from those small pat on the head, disposable income gifts to the major lifetime investment gifts. But it's also very powerful in an estate giving context. It's one of the most powerful messages that we've tested that changes people's attitudes about leaving an estate gift is when we can share stories of other people like the donor who have made gifts like this. So that social norm creation through sharing stories is very powerful. And in the estate giving context, there's actually some very deep-seated reasons why that is the case. We see that social norms, defaults are very powerful in any context that is death related. Now, why is that? Well, people respond to death, reminders, personal mortality salience with a couple of different in a couple of different ways. They'll either respond with avoidance or also with what's called pursuit of symbolic immortality. That is lasting social impact. And so social norms, what other people think of me, becomes much more powerful in a mortality salient context. And so, what other people like me are doing, what people in my in group are doing in experiments is dramatically more powerful when people are in this mortality salient context. And it also gives them sort of an easy way to get through that decision making process and move on to something else that's not death related. So, that's all to say that the way that we start those journeys is to share stories of other people like the donor who have made gifts of assets. And that's where we start transforming from the small donation to the major gifts of assets, whether in an estate context or otherwise.
That's very interesting. And the stock market, the stock gift is actually a metric that we use in my research at Fund Metric in Acadia. Is what type of gift do you give? Now, I'm not going to pretend that we put that in to because we knew it would predict major giving. We thought it might, but this is exactly why I want to have the conversation with you. Is what if say you had to build a machine learning model to predict who will give a planned gift. And you've already somewhat answered this. I'm just extending it. You would say, did they give any gifts of stock? Like that is one in there. But what other descriptors of people or features, as we call them, machine learning, do you think would be beneficial for a model?
Sure. Well, there's two different questions because of the that's different about estate gifts. One is predicting who's going to give, as well as the amount that they're going to give, but the other is also predicting the timing of the decision making, and also that which relates to the timing of the transfer. So when we look at what predicts who's actually going to give, this is just the yes or no prediction, which we can be fairly confident of. So the depending upon on how you want to weight those different factors. The number one factor is childlessness. If you have, for example, a person who is an older adult who is childless, who never donates, never volunteers, another similar older adult who gives regularly, volunteers regularly, and has grandchildren, turns out that first person is statistically more likely to leave a gift to charity at death than the second. So we start with that subgroup, which goes to the top of the list. It is a massive, massive indicator. But beyond that, what are some important indicators? Well, one is simply consistency in charitable giving. So it's not so much about having made a large gift at some point, although that's a good indicator as well. It is that consistency of year after year having donated. That is a very powerful indicator. Certainly, wealth is an indicator. The wealthier people are, the more likely they are to leave anything to charity in their estate gift. And that's something that's been sort of conclusively established by estate tax data, as well as by broader range data, that we see that the propensity to leave these gifts goes up at every level of wealth. And of course, their size goes up as well. An interesting piece about wealth, though, it's not just that a person has wealth or even that they end their life with wealth. It also has to do with wealth trajectory. That if a person is coming up to the end of their life with increasing wealth, that person is much more likely to leave a gift. If a person ends wealthy, but let's say they ended with $50 million, but 10 years ago they had $100 million, that person is less likely to leave a gift. So these are some of the key indicators. Very simple concepts, simple ideas. Now, when you get to predicting the amount of wealth or the amount of the gift, that's really dominated by actually having the wealth and the size of the largest gift that they've ever given during life. So that predicts the who's actually going to leave. Now, the issue that many people, so what makes this so weird is that the numbers in estate giving are all about the outliers. In other words, the dollars in estate giving are driven by those unusual people who leave a very large share, 90% or more of their estate, by people who have the wealth to be able to give. And the typical donors within the estate giving context from a dollar's perspective are almost irrelevant. So it is this really weird space where from a dollar's perspective, we only care about the outliers. And that's true not only from an individual organizational perspective, and you can ask any organization, okay, let me take your 5 largest estate gifts, and how does that compare to everything else you've gotten? And you'll start to see how those outliers drive everything. It's even true on a national basis, right? If we have 1 year where a Joan Kroc passes away or a J. Paul Getty passes away, it moves the numbers for the whole year. That's why it's so challenging to predict the national estate giving numbers, because still, even at a national level, is driven by these outliers. So that has to do with predicting how much a person will give. But you've got to understand that this estate giving decision, it is in many ways opposite from the regular gifts or even major gifts decision, because when a person puts your organization in their will or trust document, that is not the finish line. That's the start line. That begins a process that you hope may ultimately lead to dollars in the door. Whereas in the other types of fundraising, we're used to getting measurements that end the process. And because of this, we get some really wonky measurements that are very far removed from what actually predicts the dollars, because we're using all of these interim measurements. And oftentimes organizations get caught up on these interim measurements, such as number of legacy society members, right? But they don't they'll reward fundraisers for adding new legacy society members, but they don't reward fundraisers for maintaining those relationships. And one of the things that we see in national longitudinal data is that the charitable component in an estate plan becomes highly fluid in the last 3 to 5 years of life. So you can't simply count it and forget it. This is a process that requires staying with the donors all the way through the journey.
Yeah, that actually feeds into another question. How do you know if you're doing it well? But you've pretty much answered that. I think you have to stay on it, right? So one thing that we data scientists have to deal with is bias in the data, right? So if you just plainly feed in data to a model, it'll say all your major donors will be rich old white men because that's what was done 20, 30 years ago. So now, do you have any strategies for dealing with that, like diversification, right? How do we get away? I know I'm not trying to pull you down a machine learning rabbit hole, but in terms of the data, is there a way to get around that? Is it we don't need to be told that lesson? We're looking for new lessons, new angles, not sales angles, but new people who might actually want to give those gifts who are just not being approached, right? Because the model ignores them. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have exactly that situation when it comes to estate gifts. So, from some analysis from the PSID, and also the Health and Retirement Study, one of the things that we see is when we look at charitable estate giving among for example, racial or ethnic minorities. In particular, if we look at African Americans, if we look at Hispanic households, one of the things that we see is this barrier, not of desire or interest in leaving a gift, but a documentation barrier. So, for example, from the panel study on income dynamics, we see that when you ask people, would you be interested in leaving this kind of a gift? It turns out that controlling for wealth and other factors, that minorities are relatively more interested in leaving a gift to charity than others are. Particularly true for gifts to religious charities among African Americans and gifts to charities in general among both African Americans and Hispanic households. So we have a high level of interest. But then when we look at other data that says who right now has a charitable component in their estate plan, what we see is that there is a highly negative association between minorities and having a charitable component in a estate plan. Why is that? It's actually very simple. They have a very negative association with having documents, with having will or trust documents. Now, once you control for the propensity to have documents, and this was from a law review article of mine last year, there's no difference. May even be some positive effects, but from minority status. But we have this barrier, and it is not a generosity barrier. It is not a philanthropic intent barrier. It is a documentation barrier. And so that fits with other things we see in legal studies where oftentimes there is a barrier, a greater barrier among minorities to accessing legal services, a greater probability, for example, of being unbanked, of not engaging with the financial institutions. And so that's an example where we can see that if we just look at the end of the story and say, oh, well, clearly a minority is a negative indicator of propensity to have a charitable estate plan. If you don't understand the rest of the story, then you don't see that actually it's not a story about intent or desire or philanthropy. It's a story about documentation. It's a story about access to legal services. It's a story about being connected with financial institutions, the banking world, all of that. So I think that's a great example of what you're saying there, Greg, of looking beyond the end result and looking more at the processes and where's the barrier coming.
Yeah, and that on the data science side, that really comes in because it's very easy to feed data to a model, get output of these people will give, and completely ignore what's in the middle, right? especially these days, you can download code that will just do this for you, and will give you a prediction, and will give you whatever a decent accuracy. But when you go in, you find out, if you do some analysis, you find out, oh, there's something really simple that it's keying on here. And it takes a lot of analysis to get to what you just described, right? That I can see people giving up on that quickly and saying, well, they're not going to give, I don't really care why, instead of how do we build on that, which leads into my next question of, there's a lot of, thinking of people who are watching right now. We have some smaller universities, Acadia University, for instance. Do you have any lessons for people with, I guess, basically a little less data, but looking to improve their major? I mean, I know these are very separate fields, but I'm asking about both major giving or bequests, as opposed to, say, Texas Tech would have a huge amount of data relative to smaller schools.
Sure. Well, so let's start with bequests. Now, bequest is one of my favorite areas because it's an area where most organizations and even sophisticated organizations do things wrong, just completely opposite of how you should do things if your goal is actually to bring dollars in the door. So what's an example of this? Recently published a study looking at some of the largest charities in Australia. And one of the things that we learned from that is that people who have indicated that they have put your organization in their estate plan, so these are what we would call legacy society members, that there is still a relatively high propensity for those people not to actually generate dollars at the end of life. When we started exploring what was associated with that, well, one of the things we found is that if the charity had not communicated with that donor during their last 2 years of life, the propensity for them to receive no estate gift more than doubled. In other words, the loss rate more than doubled. Okay. So you look at that and you say, well, yeah, obviously we've got to stay in contact with the people. But here's the thing. Our systems are not set up to do that. Our systems are set up to reward things like getting new legacy society members. Now, I've just told you we're in a space where only the outliers matter. And yet we've got metrics that count everybody as one. If we've got a $1,000 gift from a 22-year-old that's planned, that's one. If we have a multi-million-dollar commitment from a 95-year-old, that's one, right? So we're in this really weird space where the counting is in many ways the opposite of what it should be. Here's the thing that throws most charities off in the bequest space. When we actually look at the lifetime journey through a longitudinal study of those who actually transferred dollars to charity at death, okay? If you go back, say, 10 or 15 years before they died, they were consistent donors. They were oftentimes volunteers. But as you approach the end of life, the propensity to make gifts, certainly to volunteer, drops to where it's relatively low in the last 2 to 5 years of life. Now, those last 2 to 5 years of life is when the actual final plans that will control the dollars tend to be being made. What you have are charities that communicate with their donors based upon recency of their last gift. So that system is designed precisely in the wrong way. It's designed to go radio silent right at the moment when those people with lifetime connections are actually signing the documents that will control the dollars. Now, why is that? Why is that taking place? One of the reasons is simply what we call in research an agency problem. The agency problem is that the person working for the organization has different interests than the organization itself. What do I mean by that? Well, look, if we've got a development director, could even be a college president, I could say that. I was a college president for 5.5 years. You're in your job. You expect to be in that for maybe about 5 years before you move on to something else. Now, think about what impact does it have on your numbers if you just don't invest anything in estate giving, right? Well, it's going to have an impact. It's going to be painful, but you're not even going to be there, right, when it gets painful, or vice versa. If you invest a lot in estate giving, which, by the way, has the greatest return multiple of any area of fundraising, that's great for the organization. But again, if you're only going to be there 3 to 5 years, not really great for you because it takes a while for these things to mature. So there is this kind of agency problem that says, oh, let's just focus on the immediate kind of communication that's going to get us the immediate reward. And maybe part of my metrics is legacy society members, so I bump up that number. There's ways to bump up that number that don't necessarily involve fundraising, and I'm not worried about the dollars that come out the end. So that's one of the challenges. But look, here's another challenge, and this is me being obnoxious, right? Everything that the data says about how you should do this kind of fundraising makes life harder for fundraisers, okay? Because it says, look, it's great to get in the plan early. Those gifts tend to be larger, but those gifts are highly fluid. The 10-year retention rate for charitable estate components is about 55%. Okay, and that's from having any charitable component in the estate plan. And then when we get to the last 3 to 5 years of life, it becomes much more fluid. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is we're looking at dealing with a much older audience. That makes your life harder as a fundraiser. It would be much easier if I told you, oh, just work with people your own age. You can put them in your legacy society, count it and forget it. You can show you're doing this good work, this good progress, and just move on. That's not the way it works. There is so much end of life instability in the charitable component, which means you've got to stay connected with the people. That makes life harder. And by the way, let me be clear about what I am saying about staying connected with older adults, because it turns out that wealthy people live longer than others do. And wealthy people with a charitable estate component, charitable wealthy people, live longer than others of their same wealth category. So we're talking about a very old age at which these very important decisions are being made. Looking at Australian data, looking at some US data, the age at which you should expect to have received 50% of the dollars from a group of donors, 50% of the estate dollars from a group of donors, is right around age 90, between 89 and 90. That means you're going to get half your dollars from people who pass away after that age, okay? So we're talking about a much older age. That makes your life harder. I'm telling you to work with people who are much older, and there can be concerns about that. There can be questions about that. We've got other family members involved. We've got for a few people, for some people, we may have capacity issues. So we've got all of these sort of complicating factors that are difficult, that are messy. But fortunately, since I'm not a consultant, I'm just a tenured professor, I can say obnoxious things all the time, and you can't. I don't have as much penalty back from that. But this is the reality of when these decisions are made. So in an estate giving context, it is that difficulty, and honestly, we can create, in some places do have systems that actually recognize fluidity, and they will reward fundraisers for maintaining these relationships. And we can actually value a gift that will not be coming in until the end of life, and we can actually compensate for the risk of loss in that. So it is possible to have those metrics that are appropriate metrics. It's just very rare for people to do that, because frankly, it makes their jobs harder to do things in a way that are actually going to drive those dollars coming in the door. So that's on the estate giving side.
And yeah, hopefully now that you've put it out there to the world or to our attendees, that those metrics go up, right? That's not stuff I knew either. Now I think we have a question over here, and I just want to make sure I don't miss them. So Alain, sorry, Tilgner, I'm just going to read it to you so I don't change any of the words. The childlessness has proven to work for us statistically. Our charity helps children quite a lot, and the legacy gifts come from parents who want the same for other children who are less likely to succeed. How do you rationalize that through AI? Or I suppose it doesn't have to be AI, through whatever methods you use. I can reread it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say I can reread that. That was quite a mouthful. to the process.
So, one of the things, Greg, that I think, or Dr. Lee, sorry, one of the things that I think that this question really brings out, certainly, can we take from that story certain metrics? Can we say, oh, we've got a flag that here's someone who is a donor who has children, and so this is an example of someone who has children who is going to leave a gift. Um, you can get those little indicators. You can get those story flags. Now the problem, I mentioned earlier that the dominant indicator in charitable estate planning is childlessness. The problem is you can't really run your whole campaign based off of childless individuals. There's not enough of them. Okay, so you're still going to get likely half or possibly the majority of your gifts from individuals who are not childless. Now, by the way, among those oldest individuals, the childlessness rates are going to be skyrocketing in the next few years, which is why charitable estate planning is also going to be going up dramatically in the next few years. But the question points to another issue when it comes to AI, which is it is much easier to identify factors that are associated with these spur of the moment, social compliance, small gift decisions, because these are decisions that are, tend to be very quick, just like other consumer purchases, right? We can really track those consumer purchases. We can look at indicators, all that sort of thing. But when it comes to these major lifetime gifts of assets, whether that be principal gifts or estate gifts, we start getting into an individualized story kind of world. And that becomes sort of the next level for AI. In other words, like, okay, we can start with, what are some basic indicators? What are some wealth indicators? What are some social demographic indicators? And we can play with that. But when we get to the next level, and we start getting into what can you do with text analysis, what can you do with things that are more complicated, that have stages, how do we start to make those connections, and that is where we're still in that world of the one-on-one fundraiser relationship, where we understand a bit more about that person's life story. And it's not just understanding about their life story, it's also getting them to talk about their life connections with the cause or the organization. So this Socratic fundraising is very powerful in that space, because even if a person has a connection, if they're not stating it and they're not bringing it to mind, it's not as powerful as, even though we could say, oh yes, you have this connection, but you haven't brought it to mind, you haven't elicited that conversation from them. So this is really, I think, the kind of leading edge of AI is how can we move to this story-based context. Now, the reality is, when we look at estate gifts, we do see a lot of estate gifts. Organizations will get gifts from people who weren't donors, just completely out of the blue, it appears. There was one really great study done in the UK, though, that did a deeper dive to investigate those donors, and it turned out that they really weren't out of the blue. Now, they weren't donors, but they actually had other lifetime connections with the cause or the charity. This is one of the things we found with the neuroimaging research that I've done here at the Texas Tech Neuroimaging Institute, is that when people are making charitable bequest decisions, they are engaging in what you might call visualized autobiography. This is compared to just small gift decisions or volunteering decisions. Those lifetime gift of asset, gift in a will decisions are decisions that engage this visualized autobiography. People are engaging in life review, and the more internal visualization that takes place, the more likely that person is to say, yes, I want to leave a gift to that organization. Now, this fits with other types of research. When we do deep dive qualitative interviews, people are talking about their life story connections to the cause. And that's what is driving the gift. Or even in some experiments with the way we phrase the gift. If we ask about a gift and a will, people are interested, but they're much more interested if we ask about a gift and a will to support a cause that has been important in your life. If we phrase it that way, it triggers life review. It causes people to think about their life story connections with the cause, and it dramatically increases their willingness to make those types of gifts. So, absolutely correct. It becomes all about the life story. And to me, that story world, that's kind of the leading edge of AI in terms of how can we take these long, qualitative, complex, fuzzy processes and wrap data around them to help us.
And it's great that you mentioned that at the end, because Colin Conrad is going to actually mention, Dr. Colin Conrad will mention that during the academic talks, just in about an hour. We're just about out of time. So I wanted to give you just the opportunity, if there's anything we missed, just to pass on. You've got so much expertise you've passed on already, but is there anything that you think people should know that we didn't cover?
Well, I just enjoy responding to your comments and questions. But look, here's the thing I would say. The bottom line is when it comes to estate gifts, not necessarily rocket science, right? If you, as a fundraising organization, just say, when somebody hits a magic age, call it 75, if they have a lifetime history with our organization, we will never stop communicating with them. We're going to pull them out separate, regardless of their giving, regardless of their volunteering. We're going to stay top of the mind. Because what most people don't realize is how fluid these estate gift decisions are. Why are they so fluid? Is it because donors are suddenly becoming angry with you? Absolutely not. Fundraisers don't understand the estate planning process. The estate planning process, when you come into an attorney's office, does not begin with, let me charge you to read through your old will that we're getting ready to revoke. Not how it works. Instead, it's, what are your assets? Who's your family? What are your goals? And if your organization is not top of the mind and the solicitor or the lawyer doesn't happen to ask the question, would you like to leave anything to charity? You're going to get left out of that will, even though you were in the old one. It doesn't carry over automatically. So that's why it's so important to stay connected, stay communicated, stay top of the mind with your older friends. Very important for this space.
Well, that's great. Well, again, thanks, Russell. I expected to learn, and I did today, and I hope everyone else did as well. So thanks very much for all your insights.
Thank you.